In May 1894, car builder Thomas Heathcoate worked 11 days at Pullman Palace Car Company and earned $11.04. The company deducted $9.07 for rent before he received anything. That left $1.97 for his family. He testified to this before the strike commission. He asked for a rent reduction. They told him rent was a separate matter from wages, and the two could not be discussed together. His testimony is one of 1,400 pages in the government printing office archive. But the center of this story is not the strike. It is what it meant to earn $11.04 and receive $1.97. If you are new to Steel and Sweat, this channel covers the machines and the men of American industrial history, the things that built the country, and what those things cost. Subscribe and leave a comment below with the next story you want us to dig into. This is the history of the company town of Pullman, Illinois, examined through the documents that recorded it. The congressional investigation was ordered by President Cleveland in the aftermath of the strike. Commissioner Carroll D. Wright, head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, led the inquiry. The 1,400 pages of testimony he collected represent the most complete record of named worker testimony about daily life in an American company town ever assembled. The 1894 Congressional Strike Commission testimony, collected and published by the Government Printing Office at the Report on the Chicago Strike of June to July 1894, the 1884 Illinois Bureau of Labor Statistics report documenting conditions in the town, Richard Ely's 1885 investigation, published in Harper's Monthly, which described Pullman as un-American in its structure, and the testimony of named individuals before the Strike Commission, including Thomas Heathcoate, car builder, and Jennie Curtis, seamstress, all appear in that record. They testified under oath and described in specific numbers what it meant to live inside the system George Pullman built. But before we get to those numbers, you need to understand what the system was, because Pullman designed it as a system, which is different from designing it as a town. You are a car builder at the Pullman Palace Car Company in 1892. You live in Pullman, Illinois, 9 miles south of Chicago on the shores of Lake Calumet. The town was built by George Pullman between 1880 and 1884 on 600 acres he owned outright. The company built the factory, the houses, the hotel, the library, the church, the water system, the gas plant, and the sewage system. The company owns every inch of property in Pullman. You rent your house from the company, shop at the company arcade store, and send your children to the company school. If you want to attend church, there is one church available to you. It is the Greenstone Church, built by George Pullman in 1882, using green serpentine stone from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It earned a 6% return on investment for him in the year it was built. The 1884 Illinois Bureau of Labor Statistics report documented this figure. If you were Catholic or Orthodox, which many immigrant workers in Pullman were, the Greenstone Church did not serve your religious practice. The company did not provide an alternative. The rent in Pullman was higher than in surrounding neighborhoods, often by 20 to 25%. Richard Ely investigated Pullman in 1885 for Harper's Monthly and reported that rents were 20 to 25% higher than comparable Chicago area housing. Rent and company control were central to that difference. The company set the water and gas rates, the company inspected your home, and it controlled which businesses could operate in town. The arcade did not sell alcohol. You could not rent from anyone else, because there was no one else. You could not shop elsewhere without a significant commute that your 12-hour shifts did not accommodate. What did you do when the company cut your wages without cutting your rent? You had no option to send your children to a public school because the company school was the only school in Pullman. When you received your wages, you received them in 2 steps. The first payment was the amount the company applied directly to your rent. The second was whatever remained after that deduction. This was the 2-check system. In months when your earnings were low, the first check covered the rent, and the second check could be nearly empty. Thomas Heathcoate testified about a month when his second check contained $1.97. He was not unusual. One Pullman worker's second check in the winter from 1893 to 1894 contained 2 cents. He had it framed. The frame check circulated in newspapers during the strike, and the company did not dispute the figure. The dispute was over whether rent could be reduced when wages fell. The company's position was that it could not. Residents understood their situation and described it plainly in the congressional record. One statement from investigations of the period captured the structure of life in Pullman. "We are born in a Pullman house, fed from the Pullman shop, taught in the Pullman school, catechized in the Pullman church, and when we die we shall go to the Pullman cemetery and go to the Pullman hell." But what did you build inside the Pullman factory? Sleeping cars. The Pullman Palace Car was the luxury sleeping car that made transcontinental rail travel comfortable for wealthy Americans from the 1870s onward. You built the frame, the paneling, and the folding berths. Jennie Curtis, who worked in the Pullman repair shop's sewing room for 5 years, described in her congressional testimony what her department produced. She testified that they made all the carpets and all the silk, satin, plush, and velvet drapings for the dining cars. They made all the linen for the sleepers, the berth curtains, and the vestibule curtains. They sewed the tapestry that covered the seats. They bound the blankets and made the mattresses for the bunks. They did all such work as that. The car Jennie Curtis upholstered did not stop at Pullman, Illinois. It was leased to a major railroad and pulled across the continent. The sleeping berths she had sewn were used by passengers whose fare for a single berth exceeded what she earned in a week. The blankets she had bound were laundered by Pullman porters and returned to the car for the next passenger. The sewing room where Jennie Curtis worked received returning cars for maintenance and refurbishing. When the carpets wore thin, she replaced them. When the drapery faded, she recut and rehung it. The car kept earning. Her wages were cut in November 1893, and again the same week, and again in January 1894. It traveled across the continent carrying passengers who slept in berths she had sewn, sat on seats she'd covered, and pulled aside curtains her hands had bound to their rods. The car had hot water, her house did not. But the panic of 1893 changed the arithmetic. A nationwide economic depression hit the railroad industry directly. Orders for Pullman cars dropped. George Pullman responded by cutting wages. Between November 1893 and the spring of 1894, wages at the Pullman Palace Car Company were reduced by between 20 and 30%, depending on the department. In some departments, the cuts came twice in a single week. Jennie Curtis testified that her department was cut lower than any of the others. She testified that in 1893, her department could earn 22 cents per hour, $2.25 per day. But by the day of the strike, the most experienced workers could only earn 70 to 80 cents a day, working as hard as they possibly could. The rents did not change, nor did the water rates, the gas rates, or the price at the arcade store. George Pullman's position was that wages and rents were separate matters, governed by separate principles. Wages were set by market conditions. Rents were set by the cost of maintaining the town's investment returns. The two could not be discussed together. This is the position Thomas Heathcoate encountered when he went to ask for a rent reduction after his May earnings left him $1.97. Jennie Curtis's situation was more specific and more personal. Her congressional testimony is in the Strike Commission record for August 16, 1894, and she testified under oath in terms the commissioners could not dispute. Her father had worked for the Pullman Company for 13 years. He fell ill, was laid off, and died in September 1893, owing the company $60 in back rent. Jennie Curtis testified about what happened after his death. She told the Strike Commission that the company made her, out of her small earnings, pay the rent due from her father. The contract was that she should pay $3 on the back rent every payday. Her wages had been cut so severely by 1894 that she could not pay her board and give the company $3 on the back rent in the same payday. She testified that when she did not do so, she was insulted and nearly put out of the bank by the clerk for not being able to pay. She'd been working off her dead father's debt for months before the strike began. She was paying $3 per payday toward $60. Her wages had been cut so severely that $3 on top of her board was more than she had left after a payday. She was being asked to pay debt with money the same company had decided she did not need to earn. She had been working off her dead father's debt for months by the time she testified. The $60 he owed had become her obligation by the company's accounting. She could not pay it faster because the same company that held the debt had also cut her wages by more than 60%. The math was not coincidental. If you find this history as important as anything we have covered on this channel, go ahead and hit subscribe now and leave a comment below with the next story you want to see. What was the legal structure of this arrangement? Who had jurisdiction over any aspect of it? The company owned the town, employed the workers, collected the rent, and operated the bank through which wages were distributed. No external party had jurisdiction over the terms of these relationships within Pullman. The Illinois Bureau of Labor Statistics documented conditions in the town in 1884, a year after it was fully operational, and described a system in which workers had no practical recourse against the company, because the company controlled every mechanism of recourse available to them. But Richard Ely's 1885 investigation reached the same conclusion and used different language. He wrote in Harper's Monthly that Pullman was un-American in a specific sense, a place where people could not in any way control their own conditions of life. Ely's conclusion was not ideological, it was structural. He was describing the absence of the mechanisms that allowed workers elsewhere to exercise leverage, chiefly competitive housing markets, accessible alternative employment, and municipal government independent of the employer. But the Strike Commission's report, after hearing 1,400 pages of testimony, described the Pullman system in similar terms. It found that the aesthetic features are admired by visitors but have little money value to employees, especially when they lack bread. It found that George Pullman had demonstrated a blind adherence to one idea, namely that the working people of Pullman had no rights that the Pullman Company was bound to respect. But the arithmetic that produced the strike was simpler than any of the investigations. Wages fell by 30%. Rents stayed the same. The two-check system meant the rent was collected before the worker saw anything. In months like Thomas Heathcoate's May 1894, the arithmetic produced $1.97. In other months, it produced 2 cents. And Jennie Curtis, working as hard as she possibly could for 70 to 80 cents a day, was simultaneously making $3 payments on her dead father's debt to a company that set both her wages and her rent. Thomas Heathcoate was the chairman of the Pullman Strike Committee. He helped organize the walkout of nearly 4,000 workers on May 11, 1894. Jennie Curtis was the president of Girls Union Local 269 with 125 members. She spoke at the American Railway Union Convention in Chicago in June 1894, and she asked the assembled delegates to support the Pullman workers. She told them they were not just fighting for themselves, but for decent conditions for workers everywhere. The American Railway Union voted to stop handling Pullman cars on June 26, 1894, unless the company agreed to arbitration. Within 4 days, 125,000 workers on 29 railroads had left their jobs rather than move trains carrying Pullman cars. The boycott shut down freight and passenger rail across most of the country west of Chicago, affecting 27 states and territories, and temporarily paralyzing the movement of mail, food, and passengers on the nation's most critical rail corridors. But George Pullman did not negotiate. Attorney General Richard Olney, who held a $10,000 retainer from the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad while serving as the nation's top law enforcement officer, obtained a federal injunction ordering the American Railway Union to end the boycott. President Cleveland dispatched federal troops to Chicago over the objection of Illinois Governor Altgeld, who said they were not needed. The troops arrived on July 4, 1894. The strike was broken. Eugene Debs was arrested and convicted of contempt of court. He served 6 months in prison. Jennie Curtis went back to work. Thomas Heathcoate was among the Pullman workers who were not rehired. The company maintained a list and kept men it identified as leaders off its payroll. The men and women who had led the local union organizations found their names on company lists when the factory reopened. Thomas Heathcoate was among those not rehired. The American Railway Union was destroyed as an organization. Eugene Debs was convicted of contempt of court and served 6 months in prison. The Pullman Palace Car Company continued manufacturing sleeping cars without interruption. The aftermath produced one permanent change and one immediate one. Labor Day was established as a federal holiday in the direct aftermath of the Pullman strike, signed by President Cleveland 6 days after federal troops broke the strike, in what historians have generally described as a political gesture toward organized labor. The immediate change was that the state of Illinois, following the commission report, ordered the Pullman Company to sell off its residential holdings. By 1907, the houses workers had rented were sold off to private owners, and the town of Pullman became an ordinary neighborhood. The system that had produced Thomas Heathcote's $1.97 and Jennie Curtis's $3 payday deductions was dissolved by court order. George Pullman died in 1897. He was buried at Graceland Cemetery in Chicago under a lead-lined casket placed in an 8-foot pit, covered in concrete and asphalt, reinforced with steel rails and topped with a Corinthian column. His family arranged the burial this way because they feared his grave would be desecrated by workers who believed he had wronged them. The Congressional Strike Commission's 1,400 pages of testimony are in the Government Printing Office archive. Jennie Curtis's testimony is on pages from the August 16, 1894 proceedings. Thomas Heathcote's testimony is in the same record. The Illinois Bureau of Labor Statistics report of 1884 documenting conditions in Pullman is in the state archive. Richard Ely's 1885 Harper's Monthly Investigation is in that journal's archive. The town is now the Pullman National Monument, managed by the National Park Service. Jennie Curtis's house still stands there. If this kind of history matters to you, subscribe to Steel and Sweat and leave a comment below with the next story you want us to dig into. Thanks for watching.